in central London. Hedgehogs used to be present in all the central London royal parks back in the 1970s and even into the 80s. But now the Regent's Park is the only breeding population of hedgehogs found within that central London area.
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Welcome back to the episode of the Urban Wildlife Podcast. Today I'm sitting with
Tony Crosdale.
And this is Billy Brown, your other co-host. And today we have
Joan Blaustein.
Joan, who are you and what do you do?
I'm Director of Urban Forestry and Ecosystem Management for Philadelphia Parks and Recreation.
Great. And before we get too much more into what Joan does and our topics for this episode, we'll just do our usual reminders. You can always reach out to us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com. You can tweet at us at urbwildlifecast, and you can hit us up on Facebook. Let us know what you think of the podcast, any ideas for future topics, complaints, accolades, whatever you want. And then please go into your podcasting platform of choice and rate us, especially if you like the podcast. Please tell your friends about it. You can use whatever medium you want. Tell them in person, tell them online, snap at them, slip them a note. But if you like this podcast, please spread the word so more people can find it and enjoy it too. So this episode, the bigger theme, I think, is how we bring nature to people in cities. What do we do to shed light on and sort of help preserve biodiversity in cities for urbanites, or people visiting cities, I shouldn't say, just people who live here. And so we thought that could unite your work, Joan, and some of the stuff we're going to hear about from Nigel with London's Royal Park System. So talk a little bit about what it is that you actually do.
Well, me, myself, and my team,
Yep.
not to put too fine a point on it, our small but mighty team are responsible for all of the natural lands in the city park system. The city park system is about 10,000 acres. More than half of that is natural lands, 5,600 acres, and that means meadows, forests, wetlands, stream corridors, those kinds of things. So not active recreation areas like ball fields or rec centers, but more natural areas. And we're responsible for making sure that they survive and that they remain healthy so they can do the work they're supposed to do.
Okay. How did you get into it?
I've been working in the environmental field for about 40 years, so I've grown up with this field and learned as I've gone. And although concepts change, the basic need for clean air, clean water, all those things remain a constant for humans. So,
Okay. You're retiring soon?
I am.
Okay. You've been at this for a while. Are there projects or initiatives that you look at that you're like, wow, that was really great, these particularly proud accomplishments, that kind of thing?
Oh, so many, so very many. One of the main ones is during my tenure we reestablished a native plant nursery for the park, which had been in existence on and off since the early 1900s and had been abandoned and fallow. It never... It functioned as a tree-growing nursery more than anything else, and now we've established it as native plant nursery where we collect seed from the local park system as well as some state parks that have unique varieties that we're looking for in order to have the species that we want to put back in the park for restoration.
Okay.
Those aren't always available in the commercial trade, so we have to collect them and grow them ourselves.
So why are native... Might be an obvious question for someone like sitting in this circle, but why is it important that Philadelphians have native plants around them when they go to a park?
I have a different answer for that now than I would have 10 years ago when I first came. I mean, the idea that our forests are considered native collections of plants used to be an assumption that everybody made, that they were native, they've always been here, this collection of plants and animals have lived together for eons. And in fact, that's not the case. It's really hasn't been the case for more than a century. I mean, most of the trees, I mean, it's been an evolution. And so the idea that there's one set of prime species that belong together in this place is really a fallacy now. And so while there's certainly a suite of native plants that we want to encourage and keep growing here that support birds that come through here on their flyway or insects or reptiles, all of those things, it's not the ultimate collection of plants that we want to encourage in this area.
So what's the reason now?
Well, essentially what are ecosystems, not just here in urban areas, but really globally? We have collections of plants and animals that have never lived together before but are functioning as ecosystems.
Sure.
Those are called novel ecosystems because they've never been in this combination before. And they are changing at a pace that normal ecosystems would go through big changes, they would settle out, they would adapt. Now, due to climate change and globalization and the impacts that are coming from all over the world, the pace of that change is so rapid that ecosystems aren't really given the time to adapt. So they're collections, they're still doing important work. They're cleaning the air, absorbing stormwater, functioning as these natural industrial areas that we need them to, but just in different combinations than we're used to seeing.
So then with native plants, though, is the benefit of native plants that they perform the ecosystem services better than others, or is it if you had a native, let's say a native cherry tree or something, and there were a European cherry tree that functioned similarly, is there something more valuable, and this is a big topic, but there's something more valuable in our native black cherry or pin cherry, whatever, that we want that even though they might serve similar ecosystem functions.
Right. So you have to separate out the function in one category. Now, they might both have the same leaf area, absorb the same amount of CO2, retain the same amount of water, do all those things the same, but they're not going to attract or support the same insect and bird population.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's really the difference. So you have to look at a broader picture that, yes, these native trees and shrubs take on more functions, but if you look purely at ecosystem function as, CO2 and water, they're the same. Yeah.
Is there an element of, this is getting a little more romantic about it maybe, but is there an element of heritage to it also?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, there are, that charismatic idea of, huge beech trees that the people associate with certain areas or certain spring ephemerals that you want to see, you make sure that you see. Yeah, that's what attracts people to certain areas.
Okay.
But
I want my trout lilies.
Right, exactly, yeah. But preserving them is what the challenge is now, when there are other pressures that they haven't had to deal with before. And that's what our struggle is here in the city, is trying to figure out what we can afford to preserve, what we need to preserve, how we do that. Yeah,
that's hard for... I think a lot of city governments have a lot of pressures and a lot that they have to spend money on. I'll say it's lovely that Philadelphia has as good a system as it does. I mean, it's
we
just really standout parks.
So fortunate.
Yeah. Hey, podcast listeners. We had a minor recording hitch at this point. We'd also started talking about McMichael Park, which is a 6-acre park in the neighborhood of East Falls in Philadelphia.
We want to make sure that in places like McMichael, where there are huge heritage trees that provide a lot of shade, we want to make sure that stand of trees lasts. We just lost a champion Paulownia there a few weeks ago. It was the biggest in the city and just reached its time.
That's a funny thing to lose a champion Paulownia, because then people will say, well, it's a Paulownia.
Yeah.
It's not a...
Right,
it's an interesting question. Okay.
But there are certain... Then you go back to the aesthetics. The people there desperately wanted us to replace it with another Paulownia.
Okay.
We've said, well, no.
And Paulownia is an exotic tree, aka princess trees, that are also, people look at them as weed species because they spring up in vacant lots and along railroad lines, that kind of thing.
Right.
Go on. Okay.
But yeah, so it's a challenge. What are you going to provide in each area? I mean, we have this vast system and we can't work everywhere all the time. So we've really focused a lot of the work on specific areas that are of a high quality or that we can put our hands around and really make a difference in, not ignoring these other areas that may be more degraded, but we have to be able to manage with the staff and resources we have and be able to not just restore it but maintain it and monitor it over a long time.
Okay. Cool.
On a kind of sad, stark note for our listeners, while Philadelphia has one of the largest park systems in the country, we also have the highest amount of poverty of the big cities in America.
The largest cities in the United States, we have we have about a quarter poverty, of the poverty line, which is incredibly. If you think about, people don't always have. This is what I do for a living, but poverty for a family of 4 is $24,000 a year, and for one person in Philadelphia, it's in the order of like $12,000 or so a year. So to have 1/4 of the population living at that level it's a big problem.
And so that means that we have such a large park system, and we have a quarter of the population in poverty. That means you have a lot less tax base to fund the park system, as you would to a comparable other big city.
You do, and I think I'd say also though that for me, it sort of also enhances the mission for the parks.
Well, certainly does. Yeah,
because a lot of people can't get out to go on a family vacation to the Adirondacks or to Yellowstone or something,
And we have parks, two parks that you could seriously think you're in the mountains.
Right,
walking
they're
around
comparable to those.
Yeah.
So part of what I've been struggling with is how to, because we know you're talking to people about biophilic cities and the benefits of nature on people, and so that's been well established that being in nature, being in green spaces is vitally important to us as humans. I mean, we need that connection, even though many of us have lost that connection, and because of it, we've lost some essential parts of it. I mean, I think some children have less patience. They have more anxiety. They have more health problems because they have become disconnected from nature. So how do you allow people to use these parks, introduce them? And the idea has always been, well, if you have parks in close proximity to where people live, they'll go to them.
Yeah.
But I've been reading recently that says no matter how close a park is, or even if someone has a yard, if they aren't oriented toward nature, they will not make use of that.
Yeah.
That first you have to have that orientation to nature. You're not afraid of nature. There's something attractive about it. And so we really have to, over the last several decades, couple generations probably, we have become, in our park system, very disconnected. So the people that use the Wissahickon or the Pennypack, some of those other parks, and are familiar with it, go. But we have vast areas of our population that have never been to those parks, and even
though they might be a few blocks away,
right? And even in our own recreation centers, there's they're devoid of nature. There may be a couple of trees. So how do we reintroduce nature on that scale, that very small scale, to children to begin to reacquaint them with nature and their benefits, and then ultimately, as generations go by, people feel that connection again.
And this is, just not to hype Tony's and your work too much, but this seems like when you guys have structured the Bird Philly program, you're not just taking people on bird walks in the Wissahickon, you're also taking them on walks in very urban settings. I mean, I know about Rittenhouse Square, but where are other places that you wouldn't think of as a birding destination?
Hunting Park.
And Hunting Park, describe it real quick.
So Hunting Park's, how large is it?
89 acres.
89 acres. But it's not, it's all manicured and athletic. It's not, there's absolutely there's not even any area of understory. So all the
grass and trees.
Yeah. Right. And then, so to get any of the only white-throated sparrows we found were in the community garden because there was some structure, right? But we saw a whole lot of raptors there, which is pretty amazing. And we picked a good time of year for it, but I guess that much open sky, we had I think we had 15 individual raptors.
Wow.
Of 5 species: red-tailed hawk, turkey vultures, merlins. We had 3 merlins. We had a sharpshin and a Cooper's hawk.
Very nice.
So it was and sapsuckers, and we had sorry, I was about to say solitary vireo. They changed the name. The blue-headed vireo, hermit thrush. It was great.
And so describe the area around Hunting Park.
So it's a very impoverished neighborhood, right? It's North Philadelphia. It's
very dense.
Yeah.
Dense, row house, North Philly, high poverty rate around there. And so it's one of these places where if you're trying to turn people onto nature in their backyards, it's a good place to start with.
Yeah.
The interview that we're featuring in our episode today is about hedgehogs. I mean, obviously we don't have hedgehogs in Philadelphia. Hedgehogs are an old world species. or old world set of species. But are there whether we're talking about birds or mammals or other animals, any examples come to mind of programming to sort of study and try to preserve species that might be sort of on the decline in Philadelphia's parks?
Yeah, how much does the individual species factor into management decisions?
Well, one of the biggest examples of a management decision specifically for bird species was the expansion of the number of meadows we have in the park system. When we took over the park system, there was virtually no meadowland at all. I mean, all the agricultural land that had once been meadows had reverted to forest or was being mowed, and so we actively set about turning mowed areas into grasslands and meadows, and then expanding existing meadows. The one in the Wissahickon in Houston
Meadow,
we took from 15 acres to 45 acres. We've created meadows all through the system, and that's specifically to support migratory bird life and resident bird life. And it was a land type we simply didn't have.
And it's something I still take people hiking there, and they're like, they just can't quite believe this is all in the city. You get some views over the Houston Meadows down into the Wissahickon. They're just spectacular.
Yeah, they are.
And we'll go there and just especially late summer, early fall, when the wildflowers are just booming everywhere, and just look at all the butterflies. It's a great spot.
It was really cool. We had an ash-throated flycatcher. Was it last winter? I think they found it on the midwinter bird census, and it's a western flycatcher, not the western flycatcher, which was it used to be a bird. They actually split into two species, but it's a western species. It's the western counterpart to our great crested flycatcher. In fact, if this bird was to show up in May or June, I would just assume it was a great crested fly. I probably would have given it a second look.
Yeah.
But even though I probably should be able to tell the difference because this is how big its crest, it's not as
I won't hold it against you.
Right. But the thing is it's very similar. It's similar enough looking. But it showed up in Tacony Park in one of those restored meadows, and it's not it's not a coincidence. This bird was wandering, and it was looking for whatever out west it's.
You get a lot more open grass.
Yeah, it's looking for edge. It's not like a grassland species, but neither is this meadow. This meadow's more like a it's a little opening with a couple of shrubs here or there. It looks exactly like you could find this thing out in out west, and it was not no coincidence that it popped in there. And so I sent around the emails, being like, look at what you've done. You build, they will come.
I'm Dr. Nigel Reeve. I've been studying hedgehogs on and off since I was a PhD student at Royal Holloway College, University of London, back in 1976. So I've been interested in hedgehogs for a long time. I was a lecturer at the University of Roehampton for about 20 years. And for 11 years, I worked for the Royal Parks in London as their head of ecology. So that's my general background, really.
Great. And for people who've never been to London or never been to Regent's Park, could you please describe the park? What's it like?
Yeah, it's a wonderful park. All the royal parks in London are extremely beautiful places. Regent's Park is unique in many ways. It's got a very varied landscape. It's about 166 hectares, so it's a big place, and it's embedded in the dense urban space that is north central London. It's in the north part of the borough of Westminster and just goes over into Camden for those people who know a little bit about London. So it's in central London, and it's got housing all around it and dense urban environments surrounding it completely. And within the park, it's got areas of grassland, shrubberies, formal gardens, but also informal gardens, woodland, rough grassland, so a whole range of different habitats. Also, within the area of the park, there is London Zoo, the Zoological Society of London, which is an historic zoo in Britain, and we're also important partners in our project. Also in there are the Regent's University and several private residences.
This might seem like such an obvious thing for someone from from the UK or anywhere in Europe, the Middle East, or Africa, but can you give a quick description of a hedgehog? What are we talking about?
Yeah, well, they're really intriguing animals, and I'm very fond of them indeed. They're about 20 centimeters or so long. That's sort of 8 or 9 inches long, which isn't that big. They are brown furred, but on the back of the animal, over the crown of its head and over its back, the fur is completely replaced by about 7,000 or so sharp little spines that are about an inch long each. And the animal, when it's threatened by a predator, will roll itself into a ball very tightly to defend itself, just showing its spines on the outside. They're insectivorous, so what that really means is they eat macroinvertebrates, so worms, slugs, beetles, whole range of insect prey, and they're nocturnal, almost exclusively nocturnal. They nest by day in the undergrowth, and then in the winter, when the invertebrate food starts to disappear, they hibernate, and they're true hibernators. They don't just go into a sort of prolonged sleep. They go into proper torpor.
Well, I guess describe the Regent's Park hedgehog population. Are they sort of all over the place? Or are they just in a couple pockets? Like, what do you find in terms of hedgehogs when you go to Regent's Park?
Well, of course, the general public never sees them because the park closes at night and the hedgehogs come out at night. So they only ever see animals that perhaps shouldn't be out, like they're ill or, not have failed to get back somewhere,
Sure.
Or they've disturbed them somehow. So normally a visitor wouldn't see the animal, but as part of the study that we've been conducting, going out at night, searching with torches, we've built up a pretty good picture of where hedgehogs are in the park, and they occur more or less throughout the park, but what they tend to avoid are the very large open areas, the sports pitches. There's a lot of area devoted in the park to public sports, football and rugby, cricket, those sorts of sports.
Mm-hmm.
And these very large open pitches aren't areas that the hedgehogs tend to frequent, but they are found throughout the formal gardens and the less formal gardens of the park. And strangely enough, there are also found a little dense population of them in the northeast of the park, where there's a car park that serves the Zoological Society. And we really don't know why they find that area so attractive, but obviously it's good habitat for them.
Okay. For someone like me who thinks of hedgehogs as being just all over the place if you go to England, why is it special that they are living here in this park in London? What's happening to hedgehogs, I guess, throughout the range in the UK and in London specifically?
That's a really good question, Billy, because a lot of work's been done in recent years, particularly by the People's Trust for Endangered Species, which is a charitable body in the UK, to conduct surveys of hedgehogs nationally using a variety of different methods, from people reporting hedgehogs in their backyards to roadkill surveys. And the conclusion of all the surveys that have taken place is that hedgehogs are drastically declining in the UK, especially in rural areas. And we believe that's the result of landscape scale changes due to intensive farming. But not only that, they are declining in urban areas. And if you look at the situation in London, in central London, hedgehogs used to be present in all the central London royal parks back in the 1970s and even into the 80s. But now the Regent's Park is the only breeding population of hedgehogs found within that central London area. Sure, there are still hedgehogs in the surrounding suburban areas and in some places like Hampstead Heath, for example, there are still hedgehogs. So they're still widespread and they're still relatively common, but the picture is one of rapid decline, and we're very concerned about them. Quite a few years ago, when I was still working for the Royal Parks, the Royal Parks, by the way, is a government agency that manages the central parks. When I was still working for them, we were aware that there were hedgehogs in the Regent's Park, but we knew nothing about them at all. We just knew they were there, but we didn't have the resources to carry out a research project. Now, since then, I've retired, and so I actually paradoxically have a little more time on my hands. And also the Royal Parks Foundation, which is a fundraising body which helps the Royal Parks fundraise to fund good works in the Royal Parks, found a source of funding for the project. So what we were able to do is, with the assistance of Professor John Gurnell, who's a very well-known mammal expert in Britain, myself, I'm a known hedgehog specialist, and the staff of the Royal Parks Foundation, and a hell of a lot of volunteers, about 100 volunteers altogether. We've conducted this study over the last 2 years, which has given us the insights into what needs to be done in this population.
Are you seeing indications of inbreeding, or have concerns that this might be too small population to be viable in the longer term?
Yes, I mean, that's one of the very big conservation concerns surrounding the Regent's Park population in particular, but also many other fragmented populations in urban and suburban areas. The fragmentation definitely leads to a restricted gene pool within the population, and we're doing work on that. And at the moment, the data are very provisional, but it does indeed support the idea that these animals are a very, very restricted genetic population. But the question is really whether that's always going to result in problems for the population.
Sure.
I'm sure your listeners and followers are all very aware that island populations can often stem from very small numbers of introduced founder individuals, and they can be very successful and breed prolifically and do extremely well. And indeed, that's the case with hedgehogs on Scottish islands. They've been introduced to some of the Scottish islands and have reproduce alarmingly, in fact, so to the point where they can actually be a pest to ground nesting birds. So it could be that even though the population is rather isolated genetically and physically, that may not result in problems for the population. But it is an issue, and it's something we are concerned about. But if you'll pardon me carrying on just a moment.
That's okay.
Probably more importantly, it's the question of whether or not that population is vulnerable to extinction through chance fluctuations in population size. And we believe that the population is very vulnerable because it's quite small. So this population is small. We think it's no more than about 50 individuals, and sometimes rather less than that. At the end of last year's fieldwork, we thought there might be only 25 individuals in the population, something of that size. So this is a very small population and could easily just become extinct through random changes in food availability or a particularly heavy mortality one year.
I had reached the end of my questions, but your comment about the Scottish Islands got me thinking about something. I mean, apparently they've been successfully introduced to islands. Are there thoughts of introducing them to parks where you do not find them?
Yes, many people try this sort of thing. Of course, there are regulations concerning introducing animals into park populations, or just translocating animals. But there's a ready source of animals from rescue centres, animal welfare centres. So what often happens is that people choose to release animals from those sources into parks, but they often don't do well. And really, we're very concerned about making sure that if we were to carry out any kind of augmentation of the population, any introduction of additional individuals, that it would be done very rigorously, and we want to be sure that the population wasn't viable in its own right. I mean, the real question is, why is the population so small and vulnerable? And the answer to that is probably there are things in the environment of the park that can be improved, made better for hedgehogs. And so what we're going to do before we consider reintroductions is really try and improve the habitat quality and make the park that much better for hedgehogs so that the population is more robust. And that may be enough to secure the population. And we'd like to do that before we consider bringing in new individuals from other populations. Okay,
thank you. That was all my hedgehog questions. Did you have anything else that might not strike an outsider like hedgehogs would, but you find really interesting about the parks or some phenomenon?
Yeah. I mean, the parks really are incredible hotbeds of biodiversity in really quite dense urban environments, and therefore, I think very, very important. But what a lot of people tend to focus on, of course, is the things like birds, hedgehogs, big warm-blooded things are the things that people tend to look at more than anything else. But of course, it's the invertebrates that are really sometimes the most striking inhabitants of these parks. And work we've done in Richmond Park, which admittedly is the largest of the Royal Parks, at about 1,000 hectares. So it's a big patch of land. It's about 2,500 acres. But all these parks are historic and have remnants of ancient habitat in them. In Richmond Park, we've done a lot of work on the invertebrates there. And, we're looking at thousands of species of moths, flies. So in parks like Richmond Park, we found that the invertebrate communities are really something to celebrate. Their historic habitats with relict habitat from long ago. I mean, some of the trees in Richmond Park are over, well, they may be 700 or 800 years old. So we're talking about very, very long-lived environments. And the work we've done in Richmond Park, we're also doing, or have been doing, survey work in many of the other parks and finding a richness of fungi and many other species indeed.
On the invertebrate theme, I've been reading about London's stag beetle population.
Oh, yes.
Are stag beetles one of the invertebrates you find when you look at Richmond Park and look at the invertebrates?
Very much so. There are two parks in particular that are very good at having decaying wood habitats remaining in them, and that's Richmond Park and Bushy Park. They're both in the southwest of London. These decaying wood habitats, where trees, when they die, the stumps are left to rot in the ground, are ideal for stag beetles, and as a result, both parks are extremely important stag beetle populations.
And so, why is that insignificant? I mean, I've from what I've read, stag beetles are that London sort of sits on where I guess their historic habitat is, and that they're otherwise in decline. Am I right on that?
That may be true. The way I understand it is that the area around London and the south generally, the south of England, is the principal area that stag beetles are doing well in. And the London effect may be something to do with the heat island effect of a big city, warming the environment to some extent. So I'm not sure whether that it's the stag beetles, whether London's on a historically important area for stag beetles, or whether in fact the stag beetles are doing well in London because it's a built environment and a little bit warmer. Because if you look at the distribution of stag beetles in Britain, they tend to fizzle out as you go further north. So it does seem that they naturally in Britain have a southerly distribution. And you're right, in Europe in general, that this particular species of stag beetle, Lucanus cervus, is very threatened at a European level. And in southwest London in particular, when you see a lot of stag beetles around, you tend to take them a bit for granted. But in fact, this is a Europe-wide important hotspot for stag beetles, yeah.
For birds, things that can fly in, and then invertebrates, which might do fine on smaller scales of habitat and to some extent can fly around, then it seems like you've got a lot of interesting biodiversity as long as you're willing to look at a smaller scale, I guess.
That's really true. I mean, the list of important species in the Royal Parks is endless, really. I mean, there are literally thousands of species of beetle. And the flies, we did some work with traps catching flies in Bushy Park. This got the people interested in flies so het up, really, that they had to carry on the work, and that resulted in, again, a new species of fly being found in the park. So,
oh, neat.
Really good. A thing called, almost impossible to pronounce. There are some brilliant invertebrates around, really.
Okay. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you very much for being interested in our work, and I really appreciate it. Thanks.
That's pretty awesome.
Another thing that Nigel Reeve talked about in the interview with him was about invertebrate life in parks.
Well, we also have policies in place where you're not allowed to remove, people can't go to the park and get firewood.
Yeah.
And I hate to say it, felt bad the other day. father with his kid was in the park, and he asked me about taking a log out so he can make a table. He's like, "Oh, well, bring my kid here." And I'm like, you really can't do that, and the reason why is because we need to have these down, trees so they can decompose and support the invertebrate populations that support everything else.
Well, we now have a milling program, so all those big, beautiful oaks and walnuts and cherries, we have a sawmill come a couple times a year and turn them into lumber that
So these are the ones that would fall down in the smaller parks. And,
right. Well, and in the other parks, and that our crews take out.
If they go across a road or something like that? Or?
Yeah. And
a lot of ash trees.
And all the ash trees that we've been proactively taking down as well. We're using those for garden beds.
Okay.
Because they're very resilient. They're not treated. They're a great way to do raised garden beds.
It's a sad story in and of itself.
Yeah, it is. It is. Because about 6% of our canopy is ash, and we're going to lose all of them, except for the few. Well, we've treated about 1,200 ash trees, so we're hoping that they survive over the long term until the bug passes.
Yeah,
through.
have they made it here yet?
Yes,
the boars?
Yes, they're
in
here.
Philadelphia.
In Philadelphia.
The last time I talked about this a couple of years ago, and they were.
We found them in June.
Where?
In the Pennypack and in the Tacony. We put traps up around the city, so they're definitely here.
Oh man! All right.
Yeah.
Who pressed today?
Huh?
This pesky metallic wood borers.
I know. I'm gonna have to go hug an ash tree while I still can.
Yeah, while you still can.
We're for the emerald ash borer. Probably a lot of listeners already know about that. But
we should talk about it briefly. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an invasive Asian species of wood boring beetle that will infest and girdle ash trees, and it's they arrived. Was it Michigan? Was
yeah?
And they think it was shipping containers.
Correct. Yeah, pallets, shipping pallets.
And they've been transported unintentionally by people transporting firewood around. And so they're one of those things that when you go to a state park and they're like, "Don't bring in wood," make sure you buy wood here. Then,
but even without that, I mean, they just move to where the next tree is, and once they've decimated an area, they've continued marching eastward from Michigan and other places in the Midwest, which is why they've made it all the way to the coast. So.
They're also a problem in Europe too.
Oh.
Yeah. You would think that they would have a bit more resistance because there's probably gene flow with the ashes across Eurasia, but apparently
maybe not that much.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it's a depressing note to end on. Let's think of something happier.
Yeah.
One of your projects that you're really into is Haddington Woods, right?
Right.
Oh,
We're going to talk about, but if you want to talk about the Haddington Woods project, because it's this beautiful piece of woods in a working class to low income neighborhood so talk about equity, it's that was a topic last night at the Commission on Parks and Rec meeting, and there's something where the city's put a lot of effort into an area that's doesn't get that much attention. So
it's major restoration work.
Yeah. So when we were looking for sites to do restoration work, thinking going forward, because we've changed our protocol, we're not restoring back to a early 20th century paradigm. We're trying to anticipate what forests are going to look like and what they need to thrive 100 years from now. So we picked 3 sites, one in the Pennypack, one in the Wissahickon, and one in Cobbs, which is Haddington Woods. And most of our effort has been in the Haddington Woods, Cobbs effort. It's the biggest site. It was the most diverse site, but it also had the opportunity to engage people from that neighborhood more closely than any of the other sites because it's surrounded by neighborhoods. It's easy to get to from public transportation.
Yeah.
So we set up this this site to do the work, but we also engaged people. We had classes that David Hewitt taught on basic land management and experimental design, and have done walks every month for the last 3 years to familiarize people with the site, make them understand that it's, even though there's a large deer fence up to keep our friends, the white-tailed deer, out, that we want people to come in. We want them to understand what we're doing there, what the experiments are we're conducting, what it means in terms of climate change, and how they can become familiar with that area.
But you had a whole lecture series at the nearby library, and you trained people to be able to go and monitor and look for things. I mean, this is an amazing program. And you're replicating it citywide, right?
Well, we did a second round in Pennypack. We did a second series of classes and walks up there around that area, And hopefully somebody will pick that up to continue this work when I'm gone.
Well, if it's not picked up by your successor, I would be happy to pick it up as part of programming.
I'm going to hold you to that.
Yeah, I'd be honored to.
That would be great. Yeah.
Very neat.
Yeah, because people need to understand how important these areas are. I mean, these forests are what's going to permit people to live in this city 100 years from now. If those forests don't continue to thrive, keeping the air tolerable for us to live in, we know what the climate projections are. It's going to be very, very hot. It's going to be a lot wetter. We're going to have, just more extreme conditions, and that's what's going to make Philadelphia a place that you can keep living.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's all a hoax. So.
Oh yeah.
That's the Chinese.
Oh my God, it's so crazy. It's just a crazy time we live in. We're like.
Yeah.
But yeah, okay. So, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thanks to Nigel for chipping in with some good conversation about some London Park biodiversity projects. So with that, we'll do our standard reminders. If you do like the podcast, please rate us on your podcasting platform of choice. Please feel free to get in touch with us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com or tweet at us at urbwildlifecast. You can also find us on Facebook. Tell your friends about it. Tell everybody about it, how much you love the podcast. Feel free to contact us with any of the ideas that you have about the city where you're living or you're visiting and about your parks. What critters, what plants are you happy to see in the parks where you live? We love listener content, and so, record something and we'll find a way to put it on the podcast.
Right now there's that humpback whale that's hanging out in the Hudson River.
You know what?
If you're...
There is, and we had an episode, I think it was the first episode of the podcast, we did about the Gotham Whale Project.
Mm-hmm.
I was visiting my sister in New York the weekend before this past weekend, and I thought the season was ending, so I took a whale watching trip out of, what's it called, Jacob Riis Beach or Riis Landing in Brooklyn. We saw 7 different humpback whales on that trip.
Wow.
All just coming from a subway to bus connection to get to the boat in our nation's biggest city, and we saw a ton of them, a ton of gannets flying around and diving on the same Menhaden, or they call them bunker there. It was just a great trip, and it was like, yep, went to New York, saw some whales.
But the thing, if you actually on the riverside of Manhattan and you saw it or whatever, let us know.
When this airs, Tony will probably be in Australia, having a great time, enjoying the summer or the spring and summer, and recording lots of great content. So we'll have one or two Tony in Australia episodes when he gets back. All right, guys, thank you very much.
Hey, podcast listeners. Since we mentioned my New York trip in the recording, I thought I'd include some audio from it. First, we have a couple minutes from when I went to the Greenpoint Cemetery in Brooklyn to check out the Quaker parakeets, or monk parakeets, depending on what you want to call them, the exotic South American parakeets that have established a population there, and a couple other spots around Brooklyn. I went there with my sister Megan and my 2-year-old niece Soji. And then later that same day, I went on a whale watching trip with my friend Russell. We left also from Brooklyn on American Princess Cruises, and they operate in conjunction with the Gotham Whale Project. And we had a fabulous time. It was cold and windy, but there were enough menhaden, aka bunker fish, in the area that they drew in a whole bunch of whales, also a whole bunch of gannets, which were fun to watch. But the highlight were those humpback whales, and we saw a total of 7 different individual whales, which was a lot for one trip, and we had a blast. So again, first a couple minutes about the parakeets, and then about 3 minutes about the whales.
And there are flocks of parakeets flying around. Looking at the sort of brickwork, or I guess it's brownstone gates. And I'll just keep recording until they come closer. There's some grackles and gulls also. So there's an old brownstone, ornately carved gate. Oh, there's one. That's one flying over. Right there. That was on the top of the tree. I'm with my sister Meg and my niece Soji. You see those sticks up there? All those sticks are their nests. They build nests out of sticks. And they like build little tunnels out of the sticks and they nest back in the tunnels and that's where they hang out. And do you hear them like the quack, quack, quack? All right, so we had a flock of what I think was like 20 or so fly away, and I think I saw Cooper's hawk, which is why they might have been flying away. So here we're looking at 5 or 6 of them sitting at the top of a red maple, just hanging out, getting a little bit of sun, maybe you're 7, because it's chilly. There's one that was, I trouble judge distance, but we're watching, oh, there it blows. 2 L's. Oh, wow. Right next to the boat. Wow. I mean, not that I can see any better, but like, it's just, you just want to jump in the water. Like, I know, right? Where are they? Don't get in. Oh, right there.
Oh, nice.
Nice. So it arcs up and you see her back and then they go back under. Oh, there's one right there. Yeah, just its back. There's gulls everywhere and we're cruising out with some gannets diving. Oh, there's a blow right there. And there's a dorsal fin. It goes back under. It's kind of like photographic whack-a-mole, you know?
Over here too.
We're sort of surrounded by humpback whales.
It's a nice feeling.
Yeah, it's nice. Oh, there she is again. You see the puff and then the back. Oh, right there next to the boat. Holy cow. All right. So now we're like keying on a couple whales. Well, a few whales, but one is a pair, apparently of we're assuming a mother and young that have been sort of like popping up in parallel, like with their backs like arcing up next to each other, and a few shots of good flukes, good tails coming up. Oh, backlit. Oh, wow. Like a beautiful silhouette of the tail. The photographers are having a great time.
Way down in the distance here, guys, off about 10 o'clock, about a mile down, and another whale just blew. Absolutely epic whale watch trip here today aboard the American Princess.